Gather round the Sutra campfire, everybody. It is time to dive into Pada 2 of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So first, let's start by talking about these padas. So the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is a book. Well, it wasn't originally a book. Originally, it was stuff that was passed down verbally, but now we have texts because we have printing, and so now it's a book. But it's divided into 4 what we call chapters or padas, which means feet. And the first chapter was on yoga, the chapter on samadhi, which samadhi gets translated on as union or illumination or the settled mind or concentration. Well, now we're in the second chapter or pada, and that is sadhana pada. Sadhana, and sadhana means practice. So some translations for this are the chapter on means, practice, yoga and its practice, treading the path, concentration, its practice. So just to give you an idea that the sutras that we had in the beginning were kind of about concentration and samadhi, and now this is about practice or about the pathway to this practice to get there. So that just gives us an idea of what's to come and the flavor of the sutras that we are about to encounter. So a quick recap of Pada 1, and feel free to skip this if you are well familiar with it. Patanjali introduces what yoga is. He says, Yoga's chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is the restraint of the fluctuations of the mind stuff. Because when you're all caught up in the fluctuations of the mind stuff, or the hamsters, or the stories, or the narratives, and all the voices in our head, then we think that's what we are. But when we sit in meditation and we connect to that witness state, when we restrain the fluctuations of the mind stuff and can be in that still place outside of the thoughts and the feelings, that's when we experience who we really are. Otherwise, we think we're all the stories in our head. Sound familiar? So then Patanjali goes on a journey and shares some practices with us, some obstacles and things we might run into, the lions and tigers and bears along the path. And he shares a bunch of practices that can help us reduce those obstacles so that we can be in that state of beingness rather than frantic doingness or thinkingness. And now that we've come to Pada 2, sadhana on practice, he's going to give us some more tools. So let's dive in. Sutra 1 of Pada 2, and this one is a doozy. I love this one. It's one of my favorites. I'm going to read Satchidananda's translation first. Accepting pain as a help for purification, study of spiritual books, and surrender to the Supreme Being constitute yoga in practice. The actual sutra is tapas, svadhyaya, isvara, pranidhana, kriya, yogah. So tapas, accepting pain as help for purification, tapas, we'll break that down a little bit more. Svadhyaya, self-study, or the study of spiritual books. Isvara, pranidhana. Isvara, remember, being the supreme Purusha, or the Lord or God, universal consciousness. And pranidhana, surrender to that. Kriya yoga, our kriya yoga, yoga of action. So here we have a nice little riddle. We have 3 parts of kriya yoga. So let's start with the first one, tapas. Now, undoubtedly you've heard this word before, or perhaps you haven't, but it means in fire, like heat, burning out. And in old school yoga, if you will, there was an idea that we would burn out the impurities of our bodies, burn out the impurities of our karma, right? So if we could just refine ourselves enough, then we could be free of all of this sludge, right? So the yogis of old used to engage in practices that were ascetic practices, things like fasting, right? Or, standing in one place with your arm up, a discipline. And the fire of the discipline, this tapas, would help to burn out the impurities in our willpower, our discipline, our ability to experience samadhi. And so old school yoga, if I can call it that, used to have those practices in it, the ascetic practices. We don't do those so much anymore, but the concept of tapas remains the same. So in a regular yoga practice, if you've ever held plank for some length of time, you know what it's like to be in the fire of your practice, or chair pose. And I know perhaps that seems simplistic, but it takes a resilience and a heartfulness and a courage and a focus to stay in a place of discomfort deliberately, right? So another translation of tapas that I really like, which I learned in my first yoga teacher training, is the willingness to endure intensity for the sake of transformation. Let me repeat that. It's a good one. The willingness to endure intensity for the sake of transformation. So we're not just enduring intensity because we're masochists. We are enduring intensity, choosing to be in intensity because we want to refine our experience and we want to be transformed into something better. So a classic metaphor is if you think of iron. You heat it up, or steel. I'm afraid I don't know my metal working, everybody, but where you would beat the iron, right? And you'd heat it up and beat it again, and you would remove the impurities from the metal. Well, it's the same kind of thing. And even though we practice that resilience and ability to hold space and intensity, we practice that on our yoga mat often, really life is the place where we encounter this. So can you think of a time where you have experienced intensity, endured intensity for the sake of transformation, or with the results of a transformation of yourself? Perhaps it was accumulating more wisdom. Physically, sure, we could talk about enduring intensity to literally create strength or flexibility, but to create emotional strength and emotional flexibility, those experiences in our lives are really the ones that are the most instructive. The most intense experience I've probably had, one of them, probably the most intense, was an experience of divorce and going through kind of that cauldron of intensity with someone else. Was it easy? No. Was it pleasant? Certainly not. But did I learn? Did I grow? Absolutely. We get changed by intensity. And if we can approach that with a spiritual eye of, I'm using this experience as an opportunity to transform, to refine myself, then it becomes a spiritual path. And our discomfort in the world becomes an opportunity to practice our heartfulness and our resilience. So tapas, that's part one. Let's take a look at the second part, svadhyaya, self-study, or the study of spiritual books. So self-study, study, refinement, self-study. I'm just looking at some other translations of self-study. So I think, for me, and this is a little bit of a personalization of this particular sutra, but self-study to me is our willingness to look at ourselves. We walk around, all of us, with blinders on, of course. How can we not? There are certain things about ourselves that we're not able to see on our own. But we can use the universe as a mirror to reflect back. Hey, what's going on? Am I drawing the same relationship into my life over and over? Am I continually being triggered and reacting in a certain way? And am I willing to practice self-study, which is to examine my own behavior and my reactions so that I may refine them, or so that I may root them out and find out kind of what they're anchored in, so that I can become the person I want to be mindfully rather than habitually. Self-study. Also, the study of spiritual books is also another translation, which we might say is a willingness to engage in a higher path, right? The willingness to be inspired by others along the path and to bring that teaching into our lives. Self-study. The third part, isvara pranidhana, surrender to the highest. Sometimes the path is not about endurance. Sometimes the path is about surrender. And it's a willingness to recognize the limitations of our own agency in the world. When we surrender to the highest, we are recognizing that we are participants in this grand cosmic dance of cause and effect. And I think there is a relief to that, because so often we feel like I am responsible for everything. And if we think about tapas, we're like, well, I just need to buckle it out and get through it and, do it. But isvara pranidhana reminds us that actually sometimes we need to surrender. Sometimes it's beyond our control. And sometimes we need to also practice the devotion of the heart, perhaps. So what I love about the juxtaposition of tapas and Ishvari pranidhana is that it doesn't give us a clear answer on what we're supposed to do, right? So for example, if the sutra was like, tapas is the answer, always endure, always effort, always strive, nose to the grindstone, then that would be a rather simplistic response. We'd be like, okay, I know I need to just hold chair forever. I know I need to put myself in uncomfortable situations always. But no, there's this other component. There's the Ishvari pranidhana component, which asks us to surrender and to recognize our place in the whole grand design and cosmic beauty of things. So, if the answer were just surrender, 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 we just lie in shavasana all the time, right? We would just like, oh, I don't have agency. It's all, I just let go. But no. Patanjali has put both of those things into this sutra, saying tapas sometimes, surrender sometimes. So there's an implied quality of discernment for us and responsibility where we have to engage and decide, is this a time for tapas? Is this a time for surrender? Now, on our mats, we're asked to do that all the time. Child's pose, or hey, take a vinyasa, right? So we're constantly kind of evaluating those things. And I love this because it calls upon us to be responsible for how we are engaging in the world. It doesn't just give us one answer. And part of that ability to practice discernment is based on svadhyaya and self-study. Am I taking child's pose because I'm just like lazy? Like one of those obstacles from Pada 1? Or is it a reflection of my discernment and willingness to surrender when I know my limits? We can ask ourselves this in relationships. Is this time to engage in a conversation which is really direct? Or is it time to let go and let be? So we can frame how we're approaching our circumstances with this beautiful, beautiful sutra. Pada 2, Sutra 2. This is fun. They, speaking of tapas, svadhyaya, ishvari pranidhana, help us minimize the obstacles and attain samadhi. Well, okay, we've talked about samadhi. Samadhi is when we restrain the fluctuations of the mind so that we can sit in our own presence. That's samadhi. So great. But they help us minimize the obstacles. What? More obstacles? What obstacles do you mean? Pada 2, Sutra 3. Here we go. The obstacles. Now, we did have a set of obstacles. That's how it was translated in Pada 1. Remember those laziness, sensuality, slipping from the ground, gained, all of this stuff. Those were also translated as obstacles, but it was a different Sanskrit word. So this word is klesha, to trouble or to be troubled. So these are different obstacles, but still impediments to the path. And these are the core root primary obstructions or causes of afflictions or misery. Okay, so Satchidananda writes, so here they are, here are the obstacles. Ignorance, egoism, attachment, aversion, fear of death. Those are the 5 kleshas. And so I'll use the word kleshas. Kleshas, it just sounds sticky, doesn't it? Kleshas. So those are the 5 kleshas. So by practicing tapas, svadhyaya, ishvari pranidhana, we can help to minimize those 5 kleshas. But wait, tell me more. So let's take them one at a time. Sutra 2, 4. Ignorance. So this is the first klesha, and it's kind of like the most important one. Ignorance is the field for the others mentioned after it. In other words, ignorance is the root cause. Our fundamental ignorance is what leads to attachment, aversion, egoism, and fear of dying. Ignorance is kind of causes all the others, whether they be dormant, feeble, intercepted, or sustained. So that just means like, are they active? Are you in the throes of egoism, or is it kind of latent in your personality? Is it ongoing? Egoism is the cause, ignorance is the cause of all of these other ones, regardless of how they're kind of showing up in your life. So in Sutra 2.5, he's going to tell us exactly what ignorance is. Is it ignorance of, song lyrics? Is it ignorance of just knowing stuff? No. Ignorance in this context is what we might call, again, the great mistake. So ignorance is regarding the impermanent as permanent, the impure as pure, the painful as painless, or the painful as pleasant, and the non-self as the self. Let's break this one down just a little bit. So ignorance is regarding the impermanent as permanent. So if you remember back to Pada 1, right? Yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is the restraint of the fluctuations of the mind stuff, because then we dwell in our true nature, purusha, which is the permanent, rather than getting caught in the stories, the vrittis, the fluctuations, which is the impermanent. So that's the fundamental mistake that we make. We think we're the stuff in our head, whether it be thoughts or feelings or whatever, rather than recognizing that we are the witness, we are the presence, the loving presence, the universal consciousness, the soulfulness, rather than seeing that we are that. So when Patanjali talks about ignorance here, he's not talking about like ignorance of our recipe. He's talking about your fundamental mistake in thinking you are the thoughts in your head. So when we regard the impermanent, all those thoughts and stories, all that stuff that changes, right? As permanent, that's when we are in the throes of avidya and we suffer for it, don't we? Let's think about that. If I think that my house is permanent, I have this idea that the safety of my house is permanent, and then it burns down, I suffer because I made the mistake of thinking that that was going to be around forever. It burned to the ground. It was actually impermanent. It's not a permanent thing. Only Purusha, the soul, is permanent. Everything else in this world changes. I think my friendship is permanent, and then my friend moves across the country or does something crappy and we're not friends anymore, right? I suffer because I thought that that thing was going to be permanent. So I was confused about what is permanent and what is impermanent. And isn't it true that when we can step back and go like, like everything here in this world, this material world, whether it's a house, a car, a job, or it's something more emotional like a relationship, if we can remember that it's all impermanent, because it is, right? Even if you make it to the end of the life, somebody's going to die, you or the other person, and that will have been impermanent. So if we can regard these things that we want to think of as permanent because we're scared and we want to hold on to them, if instead we can remember that they are impermanent, it gives us so much more gratitude. If I can, in my friendship, realize that my friend is not always going to be around, either our relationship will change or they'll go away, then I can take so much more satisfaction and pleasure and be so grateful for the company that I do share with them. If I remember that my house is impermanent, I can enjoy it fully and not take it for granted. So I think that this practice of distinguishing between the impermanent and the permanent, not only is that a spiritual practice of recognizing I'm not my thoughts, etc., but I think it can also help us be in the world with less grasping and a little bit more gratitude. So permanent and impermanent. The impure is pure. That's what, well, I guess we get confused and think our vices are not vices. Or, the impure being running around in this world is, they would think in classical yoga, they would think that this world is kind of messy. Why are you, participating in it? So it could be regarding that as pure when it's not. The painful is pleasant. Okay, let's look at that one. The painful is pleasant. The painful is pleasant is fun because aren't there so many things that you think are pleasant? Ice cream that wind up to just create a little bit of addiction. Caffeine, I love it. It's so pleasant. It's so delicious. That first cup of coffee in the morning and then like the fifth cup of coffee and then it's painful, right? Or if we come back to our permanent, impermanent, things that we think of as pleasant, now when we lose them become painful. So there are a few different layers to that one. And then, of course, the non-self as the self, which is regarding my stories, which is all my narratives and my personality structure that I create to walk around in the world. I think of that as the self, but know that is the non-self, and the self is the witness behind it. Sutra 2.6, Egoism. Egoism is the identification, as it were, of the power of the seer, that's Purusha, with the instrument of seeing, the body-mind. So Patanjali would say this is the body-mind. This is your, instrument of the senses. This is how we walk around in our little human suit in the world and interact with things. And egoism is when we identify with this as the self rather than Purusha, the witness, which is moving through and seeing the world through our senses, is the witness through us. So this is, again, we're kind of reiterating the same idea. Hey, remember who you really are and remember what you're really not, and discern between the two. Sutra 2.7. Attachment is that which follows identification with pleasurable experiences. Well, this is just like classic behavioral theory. We have a pleasurable experience. It feels good. We want more of it. We repeat. Lather, rinse, repeat. Lather, rinse, repeat. So attachment is when we get stuck on that. Like, feels good. We want more of it. And then that drives us through our whole lives. So the yogis are real big on dispassion. That is, recognizing that pleasure and pain, that we shouldn't, take them so seriously, or attraction and aversion are just kind of compulsions of our habitual body mind. Again, our senses. I ate ice cream, it tasted delicious, I want more. I have it again, I still like it, I want more. And that creates a cycle of attachment where I might be thinking about ice cream a lot. And if I'm thinking about ice cream a lot, you know what I'm not doing? Being Purusha. Right? So attachment, he says but he's not saying it's bad. He's just saying, like, this is how it works. You have a pleasurable experience and you want to repeat it. And that can lead, obviously, and ultimately to things which are super destructive, like addictions, right? So whether it's a sugar addiction, a sex addiction, alcoholism, drug abuse, all of the above, codependency addictions, those things eventually become destructive. And not only that, but that compulsion and the attachment that will be playing in our mind constantly gets in the way of us being able to sit in who we truly are. Sutra 2.8. On the opposite side of the coin, aversion, right? When I have an unpleasant experience. So aversion is that which follows identification with painful experiences. Oh my gosh, I ate sushi and then I threw up because I got food poisoning and now I am... Here's sushi. That's not true. I love sushi. But that is to say, painful experiences are sometimes, and pleasurable experiences are a bit of an illusion sometimes. If I had sushi and got sick from it once and then never had sushi again, how sad would that be? Right? So these things are conditioning. They're not ultimate truths, which is good for us to remember. Because, yogis, we want to be able to question our assumptions about things. Think about if you have a painful experience with another person. You don't know them. We might assume, my gosh, they're a jerk and I dislike them so much. And in that little cycle, we might be missing the opportunity to actually connect with this other person who's not a bad person but had a bad day. That's just kind of on the daily life level of these two sutras. But painful experiences lead to aversion. We don't want to do them, and then we avoid them. So what I like about this is it calls into question both pleasurable and painful. It's a result of that experience, and that conditioning gives us a little bit of space to question those things. And also aversion, again, is something which is going to throw up a lot of mind hamsters. Like, oh my gosh, it's that person that they're so mean to me. And then I have mind hamsters about it and get anxious all day. So Patanjali wants us to be peaceful and in ourselves. So he would ask us to notice if we're getting attached to things or if we're averse to things, and to cultivate a benevolent dispassion, perhaps, towards this. So we have equanimity of the mind, which also turns up in Bhagavad Gita, in all of our experiences, disappointment, success, pleasure, pain, that we can maintain our centered, spacious awareness and hold space for all of those experiences to happen without getting attached or running away, right? Or having a big drama around them. Hold space for all of them. And our final sutra for today, 2.9, which is clinging to life. Clinging to life, flowing by its own potency, exists even in the wise. Oof. Or another transition, the will to live, flowing along by his own momentum, is rooted thus even in the sages. So basically, nobody wants to die. Yeah, so it's kind of like, I think that they're addressing this, well, why do even great meditators not want to die or resist death or have a will to live? Like, don't just, extinguish themselves, right, in their practices. And the will to live is something that's inherent. And this is true. It's like biologically anchored in us. So even the wise have a desire to live. And we can also look at this a little bit more metaphorically, like those little deaths, right? So a little death, a psychological death, could be a death of a personality in us, the death of an era, an ending to a relationship or a part of our lives. And the fact that we want to cling to that, right, is normal. That we have a resistance to death and a will to live. And then biologically, I'd say it's like, well, why do you want to keep living even when you're enlightened and know that you should just check out? Well, no, there's a natural inherent will to live in each of us. And just to skip ahead, out of classical yoga and into Tantra, I would say that this will to live, these yogis are kind of seeing it as a problem. It's one of the kleshas. I mean, oh my gosh, it's an obstacle. But I would say in Tantra that there's a little bit more of a friendly relationship to that, where the will to live, our will, I think it's our Icha Shakti, right? Our will is part of the divine, and it's part of our desire to be and dance and this manifestation of universal consciousness and participate in the world. That there's actually something really beautiful about that. That there's a will to express ourselves and to create life in relationship to universal consciousness, which I think is a much more positive worldview, which is why we like the Tantra stuff that comes later. So there you are, everybody. We have gone diving, spelunking into Pada 2 of the Yoga Sutras. So we talked about the first one, which is kriya yoga, tapas, svadhyaya, isvara, pranidhana, kriya yoga. So the willingness to endure intensity for the sake of transformation, practice of self-study, and surrendering to the highest. Those are all the three components of the path of kriya yoga. And when we do that, we can minimize the obstacles, the kleshas, which are ignorance, mistaking ourselves, all the stories for ourselves when it's not, it's ourself. Egoism, kind of same thing. Attachment, I need things to be okay. Aversion, I don't need that to be okay. And then, of course, clinging to life or not loving change. So those are the kleshas. All right, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed. I'd love to hear from you below. What is your bailiwick? What's hard for you? Do you get attached to certain things? Do you feel averse to certain things? How do you manage your attachments and your aversions? What do you think about this idea of tapas, svadhyaya, and isvara, pranidhana? I just love it. I'd love to hear what you think. So please feel free to comment below. Meantime, subscribe if you have not already for more goodies, just to have them pop up on your feed. And I look forward to exploring more of the sutras with you.